The homeless man sitting in the rain outside Pike Place Market was about to destroy a tech billionaire's entire world with a single act of kindness. I watched Marcus Blackwood step out of his black Tesla Model S that rainy Seattle morning, his $3,000 Tom Ford suit, somehow staying pristine despite the November drizzle. Across the street, a figure hunched on soggy cardboard caught my attention, not because of his torn military jacket or the paper cup collecting more rainwater than coins, but because of how he studied every person who passed like he was conducting the world's most important social experiment. The man in the gutter held the key to everything Marcus thought he understood about Success Family and why he woke up every night calling a name he couldn't remember. My name is David Chen, freelance journalist with a bad coffee habit and an even worse tendency to stick my nose where it doesn't belong. What I witnessed that morning would challenge everything anyone thought they knew about justice, healing, and the price of forgetting where you came from. 3 weeks earlier, I was grabbing my usual overpriced latte from the little cafe on First Avenue when I spotted Marcus Blackwood, the guy who'd made headlines for buying his third mansion while laying off 400 employees in the same press release. He strutted down the sidewalk like he owned every brick and puddle, which honestly in Seattle he probably did own a good chunk of them. That's when I saw the other man. Ezra Sullivan, though I didn't know his name yet, sat cross-legged near the bus stop on cardboard that had seen better decades. His clothes hung loose like they belonged to someone else, someone who'd had better luck with life. But his eyes held this strange dignity that seemed to burn through the grime and exhaustion. He wasn't aggressively panhandling or putting on some sob story performance. He just existed there, watching the world rush past like he was studying it for some cosmic examination. Marcus walked right by, initially completely absorbed in whatever corporate emergency was lighting up his phone screen. His leather briefcase swung carelessly as he navigated through the morning crowd, dodging puddles with practiced ease. But then something happened that made me nearly choke on my ridiculously expensive espresso. The wallet's sleek black leather that probably cost more than most people's rent slipped from his briefcase and landed with a wet slap on the pavement. Marcus kept walking completely oblivious, his attention locked on his phone screen. Ezra saw it happen. He watched the wallet fall, watched Marcus disappear around the corner, then slowly stood up. His movements were careful, deliberate, like every joint ached from too many nights on concrete. He walked over to the wallet, picked it up with both hands like he was handling something sacred, and just stood there for a moment. I expected him to check if anyone was watching before pocketing the cash. Instead, he did something that stopped me cold. Ezra called out, not loudly, just this quiet but carrying voice. "Excuse me, sir." Marcus stopped, turned around with that look wealthy people get when poor people dare to acknowledge their existence. But Marcus stopped completely. Ezra approached him with the wallet extended, and I watched Marcus's face cycle through confusion, suspicion, then something I couldn't quite read when he realized what was being returned. Marcus grabbed the wallet and immediately started checking its contents with the paranoid efficiency of someone who counts his money twice. Everything was there: cash, credit cards, business cards, even family photos tucked behind his driver's license. Instead of pulling out cash for a tip, Marcus did something unexpected. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a business card. Not money, not food, but a business card. He handed it to Ezra, then nodded once and walked away. But he kept glancing back with a troubled expression. Ezra took that business card with careful reverence most people reserve for holy relics. He studied it for a long moment, then tucked it into an inner jacket pocket with the kind of care you'd use handling your grandmother's china. Then he settled back onto his cardboard, but something had changed. He wasn't just watching people anymore, he was watching that corner where Marcus had disappeared, and his expression had shifted to specific focus. Over the next few days, I found myself making excuses to walk past that intersection. Something about that exchange had hooked me. Marcus seemed distracted at work, often just sitting there staring into space instead of his usual laser focus. More tellingly, he started driving past that corner every day, slowing down each time like he was looking for something. His usual direct route suddenly included a detour that took him right past where Ezra spent his days. Ezra had developed his own routine around that business card. I watched him pull it out multiple times throughout the day, study it like he was memorizing every letter, then carefully return it to that inner pocket. He'd also started pulling out a phone, an actual smartphone, that seemed wildly out of place given his apparent circumstances. This wasn't typical homeless behavior. The business card itself became an obsession for me. I managed to get close enough one day to see what Marcus had handed over: Blackwood Tech Solutions, Marcus Blackwood, CEO. The logo was a stylized tree with intertwined roots and branches. Below the company name was a smaller line, founded to reconnect what was separated. It wasn't just any business card. It was from Marcus's tech company that specialized in family connection software and missing persons databases. Then came the night that changed everything. Marcus was in his penthouse apartment when his phone rang at exactly 2:17 a.m. Unknown number, but something made him answer. The voice was automated, clinical. Missing persons database match found. Subject Ezra Sullivan, age 35, Seattle area. DNA match probability 99.7% for genetic relative search request. Your brother never stopped looking for you. Marcus dropped the phone. He stared at the business card he'd left on his nightstand, identical to what he'd given the homeless man whose face had seemed familiar in a way that made his chest tight. The homeless man whose eyes held the same unusual green flecks as his own. The homeless man who was, according to a database, he'd helped create his twin brother. Marcus grabbed his keys and raced through empty Seattle streets toward Pike Place Market. But when he reached the corner where everything had started, Ezra was gone. In his place sat a worn teddy bear missing its right eye with a note tucked under one arm. The handwriting was careful, practiced. I kept mine too. Meet me tomorrow at 3 p.m. where we used to build forts. You'll remember when you see it. Your brother E. Marcus clutched that teddy bear and whispered the name he'd been calling in his sleep for 30 years without knowing why. Marcus drove through empty Portland streets at dawn like a man possessed, following instincts he didn't understand toward memories he couldn't grasp. The teddy bear sat in his passenger seat, one glass eye staring accusingly while rain streaked down the Tesla's windows. Every mile south from Seattle felt like traveling backward through time, peeling away layers of success until only the scared 6-year-old remained. He found himself pulling into Laurelhurst Park without consciously deciding to go there. The playground looked smaller than his fractured memories suggested, but the giant oak tree in the corner seemed to pulse with recognition. Marcus sat in his car for 20 minutes before the memories started flooding back like a dam had burst. 2 little boys with identical faces building blanket forts under those low-hanging branches, sharing a secret language of tongue twisters, promising each other they'd always find each other no matter what happened. At exactly 3 p.m., Marcus approached the oak tree on shaking legs. Ezra was already there, sitting on a park bench wearing clean jeans and a Seattle Children's Services jacket, his ID badge glinting in the afternoon sun. In his hands was another teddy bear, this one missing its left eye, the perfect match to the one Marcus clutched against his chest. When their eyes met across 30 years of separation, Marcus felt like he was looking into a mirror that showed him who he could have been if luck had fallen differently. The physical resemblance was undeniable now that they stood face to face in good light. Same height, same build, same unusual green eyes with gold flecks that caught the sunlight. Same stubborn jawline, same hands that moved in identical gestures when they were nervous. Most tellingly, they both unconsciously touched the small scars above their left eyebrows, mirror images of each other, souvenirs from flying glass during the fire that changed everything. Ezra spoke first, his voice carrying the careful professionalism of someone who spent his days navigating family crises. I've been working for Washington State Children's Services for 15 years, specializing in family reunification cases. I've helped reconnect over 200 separated families while secretly searching for my own twin brother through every database, every missing persons network that existed. 2 years ago, I found an article about Marcus Blackwood, tech entrepreneur, who built his fortune on family connection software, and I knew I'd found you. The confession hit Marcus like a physical blow. You've been watching me for 2 years. Ezra nodded, no shame in his admission. I had to know what kind of man my brother had become. I studied your company, your foundation, your charity work. I realized you were unconsciously trying to solve the same puzzle I was, connecting families, finding missing people, building technology to reunite what was separated. You were looking for me without even knowing it. Marcus felt his legs give out and sank onto the bench beside his twin. The business card, the careful way you handled it, the look in your eyes when you returned my wallet, that wasn't coincidence. Ezra's smile was sad but proud. I've learned that wealth changes people, usually not for the better. I needed to see if the brother I remembered, the one who shared his last cookie, even when he was still hungry, still existed under all that success. The homeless test wasn't cruel, it was necessary. The weight of 30 years crashed down on Marcus. While you were sleeping in foster homes and group facilities, I was in private schools and summer camps. While you were fighting through the system to become someone who helps other people, I was building a tech empire on money I didn't earn from a family that wasn't really mine. The guilt was suffocating. Ezra reached across the space between them and took Marcus's hand. You think I resent your success, but you're wrong. Every app you created to help people find each other, every missing person your technology reunited with their family, every foster kid your foundation helped. That was you trying to heal what was broken in both of us. You just didn't remember what you were healing. They spent the next 2 hours comparing parallel lives that had somehow led them to the same mission from opposite directions. Marcus building technology to connect people from his penthouse office, Ezra working directly with separated families from government cubicles and courtroom benches. Both had avoided serious relationships because something felt incomplete. Both had recurring dreams about fire and reaching hands. Both had dedicated their careers to solving other people's family problems while their own remained unhealed. As the sun began setting over Portland, Marcus made a decision that felt like stepping off a cliff. I want to make this right. I want to share everything. The money, the company, the foundation. I want to build something together that honors what we lost and helps other families avoid what we went through. Ezra's response was measured, careful. I appreciate that, but this needs to happen slowly. I need to know that Marcus the billionaire is the same person as Marcus my brother, not just someone feeling guilty about winning the adoption lottery. We need to rebuild trust, not just share assets. Their conversation was interrupted by Marcus's phone buzzing with a text from an unknown number. Family reunions can be dangerous when they threaten people with something to lose. Some separations were arranged for good reasons. End this now or face consequences that will make you both wish you'd never found each other. Marcus showed the screen to Ezra, whose expression shifted from cautious hope to professional concern. Someone knows we've reconnected, and they're not happy about it. In my experience, people who make anonymous threats usually have legal or financial reasons for wanting families to stay separated. Marcus realized that finding his brother might be only the beginning of a much larger and more dangerous story. Someone had a vested interest in keeping the Sullivan twins apart, someone with enough resources to track their reunion and enough malice to threaten violence to prevent it. As they walked toward their cars, both constantly checking over their shoulders, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched by eyes that wished them anything but happiness. Neither brother realized as they drove away that the person threatening them had been watching their reunion through binoculars from a car parked 3 blocks away, taking photographs and making phone calls to people who had spent 30 years believing the Sullivan twins would never see each other again. The harassment started the next morning with surgical precision designed to destroy both brothers' lives simultaneously. Marcus woke up to 17 missed calls from his corporate board and emergency emails from his biggest clients. Someone had spent the night systematically contacting every important person in his professional life, planting seeds of doubt about his emotional stability following what they called his traumatic family revelations. Ezra fared worse. His supervisor at Children's Services called him into her office with a thick folder of anonymous complaints, alleging he'd misused government resources for personal family searches and demonstrated emotional instability that made him unfit for child welfare work. The complaints were detailed, professionally written, and backed up with surveillance photos of Ezra's meetings with Marcus that no random citizen could have taken without expensive equipment. By noon, both brothers had received identical packages delivered by professional courier services. Inside each box was a flash drive containing hours of surveillance footage showing their reunion, their teddy bear exchange, even intimate conversations recorded through directional microphones from impossible distances. The message was clear: they were being watched by people with resources, technology, and no moral boundaries about invading privacy. The digital harassment was accompanied by a formal legal document that made Marcus feel like he'd been punched in the stomach. A cease and desist order from the law firm of Sterling Hartwell and Associates, representing unnamed clients with legal standing in what they termed a violation of permanent family separation agreements dating back 30 years. The language was dense, but the threat was crystal clear. Any continued contact between Marcus Blackwood and Ezra Sullivan would result in lawsuits for breach of contract and violation of legally binding adoption terms. Marcus had never seen any adoption contracts, had never signed any legal documents about family separation, had never even known he had a brother until 3 days ago. But according to these lawyers, someone had made promises 30 years ago that Marcus and Ezra would never find each other, and their reunion was causing significant distress to parties who had legal and financial interests in maintaining that separation. That afternoon, Marcus drove to the family home in Portland, where his adoptive parents, James and Helen Blackwood, still lived in the same Tudor mansion, where he'd grown up believing he was an only child rescued from tragic circumstances. James answered the door looking older than Marcus, remembered with the drawn expression of a man carrying 30 years of guilt that was finally catching up with him. "We never told you the whole truth about your adoption because we thought it would be kinder not to know." James led Marcus into the study where childhood photos lined the walls most, showing Marcus alone or with James and Helen. When the adoption agency approached us, they said there were 2 boys available twins who had lost their parents in a house fire. They said it would be better for both children if they were placed with different families given fresh starts without the trauma of shared memories. The revelation hit Marcus like ice water. You chose me over him. You looked at both of us and decided you only wanted one. James's face crumpled with shame that had been building for 3 decades. The agency said you were more advanced, developmentally scored higher on their assessment tests, showed more promise for academic success. They said Ezra was more emotionally damaged by the fire, would require more therapy and special attention. We wanted a child we could help succeed, not one we'd have to fix. Marcus felt sick understanding the arbitrary nature of his privilege. A few points on some agency test had determined which twin got private schools and which got foster care, which one got a trust fund, and which one got government assistance, which one grew up with stability, and which one learned that families were temporary arrangements. The randomness of it was almost worse than if there had been some logical reason. But James wasn't finished. The adoption agency made us sign legal agreements, promising we would never allow you to search for your birth family or your brother. They said permanent separation was psychologically healthier for twins, that maintaining any connection would prevent proper development and family bonding. We paid extra fees for what they called guaranteed placement security, which meant they would monitor the situation and intervene if either twin ever tried to reconnect. The pieces started falling into place with sickening clarity. That's who's threatening us now. The adoption agency, or whoever runs it now, they're still trying to enforce a contract you signed 30 years ago. James nodded miserably. Sunrise Family Services was the agency name. They specialized in what they called permanent family solutions for wealthy clients who wanted children without the complications of birth family interference. We thought we were giving you the best possible life, but we were really buying you like expensive merchandise with a no-return policy. Marcus pulled out his phone and called Ezra, immediately putting him on speaker. My supervisor just suspended me pending a full investigation, Ezra reported. But I've been doing some research on Sunrise Family Services. They're still operating now, run by the founder's son, Victor Sunrise. They've built their entire reputation on placement success rates that are impossibly high, which makes sense if they're using legal intimidation and surveillance to prevent any family reunifications that might damage their statistics. The 3 of them spent the next 2 hours researching Victor Sunrise and his network of lawyers, private investigators, and political connections. What they found was a sophisticated operation that charged wealthy clients premium fees for adopting children while guaranteeing those children would never have contact with birth families or separated siblings. Victor's business depended on keeping families permanently fractured, and Marcus and Ezra's reunion represented a direct threat to his empire. That evening, Helen Blackwood called James's phone in a panic, reporting that men in dark suits had come to the house asking questions about Marcus's recent family contacts and making thinly veiled suggestions that continued interference in adoption matters could have serious consequences. The men had left business cards for a private security firm, but their questions had felt more like threats than offers of help. Marcus realized they were no longer dealing with paperwork and legal intimidation. Victor Sunrise had escalated to physical surveillance and direct intimidation, which meant he was either desperate to stop their reunion or confident that his connections could protect him from legal consequences. Either way, the Sullivan twins were now caught in a battle with someone who had unlimited resources and 30 years of experience destroying families for profit. That night, as Marcus drove back to Seattle with James's confession weighing on his mind, his phone rang with a call from Ezra. I've been thinking about our parents, about what really happened in that fire. If Victor Sunrise was already in the business of permanent family separation 30 years ago, if he had legal and financial reasons for keeping families apart, then maybe our parents' death wasn't the accident everyone assumed it was. The suggestion hung in the air between them like a toxic cloud. Someone had built a fortune on the premise that families were better off broken, that children were better off without their birth connections. If that someone had been willing to threaten and intimidate to maintain those separations, what else might they have been willing to do to protect their business model from inconvenient questions or persistent family searches? Ezra's connection at the FBI turned out to be Agent Maria Santos, a specialist in interstate adoption fraud who had been building a case against Victor Sunrise for 3 years, without enough evidence to make arrests. When the Sullivan twins walked into her downtown Seattle office with boxes of surveillance photos and legal threats, Santos looked like a detective who had just been handed missing puzzle pieces. The FBI had been tracking suspicious patterns in Sunrise Family Services operations since 2019, Santos explained as she spread case files across her conference table. Unusually high placement fees, exclusively wealthy clients, and a perfect track record of 0 family reunifications that seemed statistically impossible unless someone was actively preventing them. Most concerning was the pattern of birth parents who died in accidents shortly after beginning searches for their adopted children, but the deaths were spread across multiple states, making connections difficult to establish. Marcus felt his blood turn to ice as Santos showed them a map with red pins marking Sunrise client locations and black pins marking where birth parents had died in the years following adoptions. The pattern was subtle, but undeniable clusters of suspicious deaths always occurred within proximity of Sunrise placements, and they always happened when birth parents got too close to finding their children. Your parents weren't the first, and they weren't the last, Santos continued. David and Maria Sullivan survived the house fire that was supposed to kill them, spent 2 years in hospitals recovering from severe burns, then began searching for their twin son. According to hospital records we obtained through federal subpoena, they hired a private investigator in 1995 who traced the twins to adoptive families in Oregon and Washington. The timeline Santos constructed was methodical and heartbreaking. The Sullivans had been close to finding their sons when they died, in what Portland police classified as a single-car accident on a rainy night in November 1995. The car went off a bridge with no witnesses, and both parents were found with sedatives in their blood at levels that should have prevented safe driving. Whether Victor directly caused the accident or created conditions that led to it remained unclear, but the timing was unmistakably convenient for his business interests. But Santos also had news that would change everything the Sullivan twins thought they knew about their family. The private investigator your parents hired kept detailed records that we've now recovered. According to birth records that Victor tried to destroy, you weren't twins at all. You were triplets, and your sister Luna was adopted through a different agency in Vancouver, Canada. The revelation hit both brothers like a physical blow. Marcus had spent 30 years feeling like half a person because he was missing his twin, but he'd actually been missing 2/3 of his identity. Ezra had been searching for his brother, while a sister he didn't know existed was somewhere in Canada, probably dreaming about the siblings she couldn't remember. Santos slid another file across the table. Luna Chen, married name, kept her adoptive family's surname. She's 35 years old, a pediatric surgeon at Vancouver General Hospital, and according to her professional presentations, she specializes in adoption trauma therapy for children. Like both of you, she chose a career that unconsciously addressed the wounds created by your family's separation. The photographs were unmistakable. Luna had the same green eyes with gold flecks, the same stubborn jawline, the same unconscious gestures. In her medical conference photos, she wore sleeveless dresses that clearly showed the crescent-shaped birthmark on her left shoulder that matched identical marks Marcus and Ezra discovered on their own bodies. Luna was scheduled to speak at a medical conference at Seattle Children's Hospital the following week about treating adoption trauma in pediatric patients. It was an opportunity too perfect to be coincidental, except that Santos's investigation had uncovered evidence that Victor monitored his former clients through social media and professional networks. If Luna was coming to Seattle, Victor already knew. The FBI had been preparing to move against Victor for months, but they needed cooperation from someone inside his network. The Sullivan triplets represented the perfect combination of evidence and motivation they were living. Proof that his business model was built on destroying families. They had resources to fight back against his legal intimidation. Reunion would generate media attention that could expose his operations to public scrutiny. Santos proposed a plan that was both elegant and dangerous. Marcus and Ezra would attend Luna's medical conference, as planned, wearing FBI recording devices to document any attempts Victor made to prevent the triplet reunion. Federal agents would be positioned throughout the hospital, but the brothers would be exposed until Luna was safely in federal protection. The plan required the twins to act as bait in a trap, designed to catch someone who had been eliminating threats to his business for 30 years. If Victor decided that 3 dead triplets were easier to manage than 3 living witnesses, the FBI's protection might not be enough. But Santos offered them something they wanted more than safety: the truth about what really happened to their parents, and the chance to prevent Victor from destroying other families. The recording devices would capture evidence of conspiracy and extortion that could put Victor Sunrise in federal prison. As the Sullivan twins left the FBI office with recording equipment hidden in their jackets, Marcus realized they were no longer just trying to heal their own family wounds. They were carrying the hopes of dozens of families whose loved ones had died trying to find their children, hundreds of adoptees who had been told their birth families were dead when they might actually have been eliminated for asking inconvenient questions. That night, Marcus's phone buzzed with a text message that made his blood run cold. The message came from an unknown number but was unmistakably from someone who knew what the FBI was planning. "Tomorrow, your sister arrives in Seattle for her conference. She has no idea that her adoptive father was one of our clients, that her entire life has been built on the same lies that shaped yours. You can try to warn her, but remember that we've been playing this game much longer than you have. Some families are meant to stay broken." The message was followed by a photograph that made Marcus's hands shake. It showed Luna Chen walking out of Vancouver General Hospital completely unaware that she was being watched by people who had already destroyed her birth parents and had no qualms about adding 3 more names to their list. Luna Chen's voice shook when she called Marcus at 3 a.m. from her Vancouver apartment security alarms blaring in the background. "Someone just tried to break into my building through the medical records storage room where I keep my adoption therapy files. The police are here, but whoever it was got away and they left something behind that has my name on it and your business card attached." Marcus was already pulling on clothes, as Luna described, finding a manila envelope containing surveillance photos of herself at work, detailed information about her travel plans to Seattle, and a handwritten note warning her to cancel her medical conference presentation and avoid contact with Marcus Blackwood or Ezra Sullivan if she valued her safety and career. The note was signed with the Sunrise Family Services logo. By dawn, Luna was driving south toward Seattle in her Honda Civic, with a suitcase full of adoption records, childhood photos, and medical files that might contain clues about her birth family. She had called in sick to the hospital and told her adoptive parents she was taking emergency leave to deal with a personal crisis. What she hadn't told anyone was that she'd been having the same recurring dreams about fire and reaching hands since childhood. Marcus and Ezra met Luna at a downtown Seattle coffee shop that Agent Santos had chosen because it was public enough to discourage violence, but isolated enough for FBI surveillance equipment to record conversations clearly. When the 3 siblings sat down together for the first time in 30 years, the physical resemblance was so striking that other customers started taking photos, sensing they were witnessing something extraordinary. Luna's first words were directed at Marcus with a mixture of anger and desperation. "My adoptive father called me at 6 this morning after I left Vancouver. He told me things about my adoption that he's never mentioned before. Dr. James Chen wasn't just a pediatrician who wanted to help a child from a tragic background. He was specifically recruited by an adoption agency because his medical credentials could suppress any records indicating I was part of a multiple birth." The confession hit Marcus like a punch to the chest. "Your adoptive father was part of the conspiracy too." Luna nodded, tears streaming as she realized the scope of deception that had shaped her existence. "He admitted that he paid extra fees to ensure I would never learn about my siblings, that he falsified medical documents to show me as a singleton birth, that he's been reporting my psychological health to someone at Sunrise Family Services every year since my adoption." Ezra leaned forward with professional intensity. "Luna, I need you to understand that your adoptive father might not have known about the more extreme methods about Victor's willingness to eliminate threats. Many of the adoptive parents were victims too manipulated by people who promised them the perfect family experience." But Luna's response revealed the depth of her betrayal. He knew Ezra. "When I confronted him about the dreams about my obsession with helping separated siblings, about why I became a doctor, specializing in adoption trauma, he told me he'd been instructed to monitor my psychological development and report any signs that I was unconsciously searching for birth family. He's been paid a consultation fee every year for 30 years to make sure I never got too close to finding you." The revelation that Luna's adoptive father had been a paid informant meant their reunion was being monitored and reported in real time to people who had already demonstrated willingness to use extreme measures. Agent Santos confirmed through her earpiece that Victor Sunrise had been making phone calls all morning to contacts in Seattle, Vancouver, and Portland. The immediate danger became apparent when Luna's phone started receiving calls from numbers she didn't recognize, each caller claiming to represent different law enforcement agencies with urgent questions about her involvement in an ongoing federal investigation. The calls were designed to create confusion and panic to make Luna believe she was in legal trouble and needed to distance herself from Marcus and Ezra immediately. Victor's desperation became clear when Marcus received a call on his business line from someone claiming to be Victor Sunrise himself. The voice was calm, professional, almost grandfatherly, as it explained that the Sullivan children had been separated for excellent psychological reasons that remained valid 30 years later. Twins and triplets who reunite after long separations often experience severe identity crises and psychological problems that can destroy their careers and mental health. Victor offered what he called a compassionate resolution. Each sibling would receive a substantial financial settlement in exchange for signing new agreements to cease all contact and refrain from discussing their adoption circumstances. The settlements would be large enough to ensure comfortable retirements, but they would require the siblings to relocate to different countries and avoid future contact that might trigger psychological problems. The offer was accompanied by detailed psychological reports allegedly showing that adoptees who reunite with separated siblings experience higher rates of depression, anxiety, and relationship failure than those who accept their adoptive circumstances. Victor had spent 3 decades building a database of selective research to justify his business model. But Luna's response revealed the fury of a medical professional who recognized manipulated data. "I've spent 15 years treating adoption trauma in children, and I've seen the damage that family separation creates in developing minds. Those psychological reports are garbage science designed to justify profitable cruelty, and anyone who uses them to separate families is committing systematic child abuse for financial gain." The conversation was being recorded by FBI equipment, but Victor seemed unconcerned as he escalated his threats beyond psychological manipulation into direct intimidation. The Sullivan children needed to understand that their parents had died because they refused to accept that some separations were permanent and beneficial. If the children were similarly stubborn about accepting professional guidance, they might find themselves facing the same kind of unfortunate accidents. Agent Santos chose that moment to reveal the FBI presence by walking directly to their table and placing Victor Sunrise under arrest via speakerphone for conspiracy extortion and making terroristic threats against federal witnesses. The arrest was coordinated with raids on Sunrise Family Services offices in 3 states and protective custody arrangements for the Sullivan triplets. But Victor's final words revealed that the operation had been anticipated. "You think this ends with my arrest, but I'm just the public face of a business model that generates billions of dollars for people who will never allow their investments to be destroyed by 3 sentimental children. My associates have contingency plans for situations exactly like this one." As federal agents surrounded the coffee shop and began escorting the Sullivan triplets to secure locations, Luna grabbed both her brother's hands with fierce determination. "Whatever happens next, we face it together. We've spent 30 years apart, and I'm not losing my family again because some criminals built their fortune on our separation." The federal courthouse in downtown Seattle had never seen media coverage like what surrounded the Sullivan triplets as they walked up marble steps to testify against Victor Sunrise and his network. News vans lined the street for blocks, reporters shouted questions in multiple languages, and social media exploded with hashtags supporting family reunification rights and demanding justice for murdered birth parents. Marcus felt overwhelmed until he saw the faces in the crowd that mattered most. Dozens of adoptees holding photos of siblings they were still searching for birth, parents carrying pictures of children taken from them decades ago, foster care advocates demanding reform. Their story had become a symbol of something much larger than their personal reunion. Agent Santos had spent months building her case, and the scope of Victor's criminal network had exceeded even her worst fears. The raid on Sunrise Family Services uncovered financial records showing payments to corrupt social workers, judges, and medical professionals across 12 states and 3 Canadian provinces. Victor's business model had required an entire ecosystem of institutional corruption to function. The trial lasted 3 weeks and featured testimony from dozens of families who had paid premium fees for guaranteed permanent separations, birth parents whose searches had been sabotaged through legal intimidation, and adoptees who had discovered their supposedly dead birth families were actually eliminated when they got too close to finding their children. Luna's testimony as a medical expert proved devastating to Victor's defense strategy. She methodically dismantled every piece of research Victor had used to justify family separation, explaining how studies were funded by agencies with financial interests in maintaining separations, and how data had been manipulated to support predetermined conclusions. Her professional credentials made it impossible for Victor's lawyers to dismiss her expertise, and her personal story gave emotional weight to her technical analysis. Marcus testified about the business methods Victor had used to build his empire, comparing Sunrise operations to financial fraud schemes that destroyed families through deliberate deception. Ezra focused on the systematic damage Victor's methods had inflicted on children's psychological development and family attachment capabilities. The turning point came when Victor took the stand in his own defense, confident that his wealth and connections could minimize legal consequences. He spent 3 hours explaining his philosophy about family optimization, arguing that children were better served by carefully selected permanent placements than by maintaining traumatic connections to birth families struggling with poverty or other problems. But Victor's arrogance became his downfall when Luna's lawyer asked a simple question. Your records show that David and Maria Sullivan were college-educated, employed homeowners with no history of substance abuse or criminal behavior when their children were taken. What family optimization purpose was served by preventing their reunion after they recovered from their injuries? Victor's answer revealed the cold calculation behind 30 years of family destruction. The Sullivan parents were persistent in their search efforts and willing to spend significant resources on private investigators and legal challenges. Allowing them to succeed would have established legal precedents that could have undermined our entire business model and encouraged other birth parents to challenge permanent placement decisions. Their elimination was necessary to protect the interests of hundreds of adoptive families who had paid for guaranteed separation services. The admission that he had arranged the elimination of David and Maria Sullivan to protect his business interests was captured on court recordings that would be played on news programs worldwide. Victor had been so focused on justifying his business philosophy that he forgot he was confessing to conspiracy in front of a federal jury and television cameras. The verdict came after only 6 hours of deliberation. Victor Sunrise was convicted on 43 counts of conspiracy, extortion fraud, and accessory to murder, with a sentence of life in federal prison. His network received sentences ranging from 15 to 25 years, and civil judgments awarded hundreds of millions in damages to affected families. But the legal victory was only the beginning of healing for the Sullivan triplets, who had to learn how to be siblings after 30 years of believing they were alone. They spent months in intensive family therapy, working with specialists who helped them process separation trauma while building new relationships based on their adult identities. The healing happened in small moments that felt miraculous after decades of emptiness. 3 weeks after Victor's conviction, they had their first dinner together in Marcus's modest kitchen. Luna had made Irish stew, using a recipe their grandmother Elena had sent from Ireland after seeing their story on international news. Ezra brought bread from the homeless shelter's bakery program. Marcus provided wine that cost more than most people's monthly rent, then felt embarrassed about the price difference. Remember how we used to fight over who got the biggest piece? Luna said, cutting stew portions carefully equal. I don't actually remember, Marcus admitted, but I always do that with everything. Even business deals. Ezra laughed. I do portion control at work events. Always make sure every family gets exactly the same resources. They sat in comfortable silence, realizing their unconscious behaviors had been shaped by lost sibling dynamics. What do you think Mom and Dad would say seeing us now? Luna asked. Ezra reached across the table, took both their hands. Probably that we talk too much and don't eat enough, Marcus said, making them all laugh for the first time since reunion. It was an ordinary moment, siblings teasing and sharing food, but for 3 people who'd spent 30 years feeling incomplete ordinary felt miraculous. Marcus teaching Ezra to use technology platforms that had made him wealthy, realizing his brother's social work expertise could revolutionize how family connection software actually served families. Luna showing both brothers how to recognize adoption trauma symptoms in other people, helping them understand their own emotional struggles, had been normal responses to abnormal circumstances. 3 weeks later, the Sullivan triplets drove to the cemetery where their parents were buried, carrying flowers, family photos, and a letter they had written together, promising to honor David and Maria's memory by helping other separated families find each other. Standing at their parents' graves for the first time as a complete family, they made a pact to transform their trauma into healing for families torn apart by systems that prioritize profit over human connection. Marcus placed his hand on the headstone and whispered words he'd been saying in his sleep since childhood. We found each other just like we promised. Luna added her own promise spoken with fierce determination. We'll make sure other families don't have to wait 30 years to come home. As they walked away from the cemetery together, arms linked like the children they had once been, Marcus felt complete for the first time in his adult life. The empty space that had driven him to build connection technology, the restless searching that had prevented lasting relationships, the persistent sense that something essential was missing, all of it had been healed by finding the family he'd never stopped loving even when he couldn't remember their names. But Agent Santos approached them as they reached their cars with news that would transform their personal healing into a mission that could prevent other families from experiencing what they had endured. The FBI had received calls from adoption fraud investigators in 17 countries asking for assistance with cases showing patterns similar to Victor's operations. There was growing evidence that Sunrise Family Services had been part of an international network still operating under different names worldwide. The Sullivan triplets looked at each other and knew without speaking that their fight for justice was expanding beyond their own story into something that could protect thousands of other families from institutional cruelty. They had found each other against impossible odds, survived attempts to eliminate them, and brought down the criminal network that had murdered their parents. Now they had the opportunity to make sure no other family would have to endure what they had survived. 1 year after that rainy morning when a homeless man returned a wallet to a tech mogul at Pike Place Market, I stood on the exact same corner watching the Sullivan triplets gather for their anniversary visit. Everything about them had transformed beyond recognition. Marcus wore a simple sweater. Instead of $1,000 suits, Ezra carried himself with confidence born from life's work, finally finding its true purpose, and Luna radiated calm satisfaction of a doctor whose personal healing had deepened her ability to heal others. The small plaque mounted on the brick wall behind them read Sullivan Family Reunion Site, established by the Seattle Parks Department, to commemorate the location where 3 separated siblings found each other and sparked an international movement for adoption reform. Tour groups stopped by daily to hear how a simple act of kindness had exposed criminal conspiracy and saved thousands of families. I approached them with my notebook and the kind of smile reserved for stories that restore faith in humanity's capacity for justice and healing. I've been covering family reunion stories for 15 years, but I've never seen anything like what you 3 have accomplished. The Sullivan Foundation has reunited over 1,200 families in 38 countries, reformed adoption laws in 6 states, and generated more than $50 million in donations for family reunification services worldwide. The numbers were impressive, but they didn't capture personal transformation that had occurred in each sibling's life as they learned to channel trauma into healing for others. Marcus had restructured his entire business empire around family connection technology that actually served families rather than generating data for corporate profits. His apps were now used by adoption agencies and missing persons databases across 4 continents, all operating under strict ethical frameworks. Ezra had accepted a position as Director of Family Reunification for the FBI, leading a task force that investigated adoption fraud cases and coordinated with international law enforcement. His professional expertise combined with personal experience made him uniquely qualified to recognize patterns other investigators might miss. Luna had established the Sullivan Institute for Adoption Trauma Recovery, a medical research facility that provided therapy for adoptees, birth parents, and adoptive families affected by separation trauma. Her groundbreaking research on psychological effects of sibling separation had become required reading in social work programs worldwide, but their professional achievements paled compared to personal healing that had occurred as they learned to be siblings after 30 years of unconscious searching. They had dinner together every Sunday at Marcus's house, a modest home he had purchased because it had enough space for extended family gatherings and a large kitchen where Luna could experiment with recipes from the Irish cookbook their grandmother had sent them. Elena Sullivan's surprise video call 6 months earlier had completed the final piece of their family puzzle. At 78 years old, their father's mother had been searching for missing grandchildren since learning of David's death, hiring private investigators despite limited resources. When she saw their story on international news broadcasts, she recognized the family resemblance immediately and contacted the Sullivan Foundation. The video call with Elena had been emotional in ways none of them expected, filled with stories about their father's childhood and County Cork family traditions that connected them to generations of Sullivans who had emigrated to America and promises to visit Ireland the following summer to meet aunts, uncles, and cousins who had been mourning the loss of David's family for decades. Elena's stories helped them understand their unusually strong sibling bond wasn't just emotional but ancestral, rooted in generations of Sullivan family traditions that emphasized the sacred nature of family connections and moral obligation to protect those connections against any force that tried to break them apart. Their reunion wasn't just healing their own trauma, but honoring a family legacy that valued love over profit. As they stood together at Pike Place Market, watching early morning vendors set up their stalls, Marcus reflected on how different his life had become since that morning when returning a wallet seemed like the most significant event of his day. He no longer woke up feeling incomplete, no longer avoided serious relationships because something essential was missing from his identity, no longer built technology designed to solve problems he couldn't consciously identify. Luna pulled out her phone to show me the latest statistics from their foundation's annual report. We've helped reunite 47 families just this month, prevented 6 potentially fraudulent adoptions, and provided therapy services to over 300 adoptees dealing with separation trauma. The ripple effects from our story keep expanding in ways we never expected. Ezra added his perspective. The children I treat now have access to resources and support systems that didn't exist when we were growing up, feeling like something essential was missing. We've changed the conversation about adoption from focusing on what's best for adoptive parents to focusing on what's best for children and birth families. As their conversation continued, other people began recognizing them and approaching with their own stories of family separation and reunion adoption, trauma, and healing. Some were adoptees who had found birth families using resources the Sullivan Foundation provided. Others were birth parents reunited with children they thought they'd lost forever. The most meaningful encounter came from a young woman who approached with 2 children in tow twins, who looked about 6 years old and bore unmistakable resemblance to each other. My twins were separated after my husband died, and I couldn't care for them alone, she explained, tears streaming. The agency told me they'd be better off in different homes, that they were too attached to each other. I spent 3 years fighting to get them back, and your foundation's legal advocacy program helped me prove that separation was unnecessary and harmful. Marcus knelt down to talk to the children, who immediately reminded him of himself and Ezra at that age. Did you miss your brother and sister when you were apart? He asked gently. The boy nodded solemnly while the girl reached for her twin's hand. We dreamed about each other every night, the girl said with matter-of-fact tone children use to describe experiences adults find miraculous. We knew we belonged together, even when the grown-ups said we were better off alone. Her words echoed the dreams that had haunted all 3 Sullivan siblings throughout their separation, the persistent sense that essential parts of themselves were missing and needed to be found before they could feel complete. As the morning crowd at Pike Place Market grew larger and more diverse, Marcus realized their story had become part of something much larger than individual healing. They had proven that family bonds could survive any separation if people were willing to fight for them, that institutional corruption could be exposed by ordinary people with extraordinary determination, and that personal trauma could be transformed into healing if survivors were willing to turn their pain into purpose. The final surprise of their anniversary visit came when Ezra pulled out a letter that had arrived at the Foundation's office that morning from Ireland. Elena Sullivan had written to tell them she'd been in contact with other families whose children had emigrated to America and been separated by adoption fraud schemes. She was organizing an international conference in Dublin to connect families affected by institutional separation and develop strategies for preventing future crimes against family integrity. Your grandmother wants us to bring our expertise to Ireland to help other families find each other, Ezra explained, as Luna and Marcus read Elena's invitation with growing excitement. She says the Sullivan family has always been fighters when it comes to protecting what matters most, and she's proud that her American grandchildren are carrying on that tradition. As they prepared to leave Pike Place Market and return to their respective homes and responsibilities, the Sullivan triplets took one last look at the corner, where a homeless man had returned a wallet to a businessman and changed 3 lives forever. The simple act of kindness that had started their journey had rippled outward into a movement that was protecting thousands of families from institutional cruelty, and those ripples were still expanding in directions they could never have imagined. I watched them walk away together, arms linked, like the children they had once been, carrying satisfaction of people who had transformed their deepest wounds into their greatest strength. Sometimes the universe has perfect timing about healing what's broken, I wrote in my notebook. The Sullivan triplets had proved that no matter how long someone has been missing, love finds a way home when people are brave enough to keep looking and strong enough to fight for what they find. Do you feel invisible in a world that judges by appearances, wondering if anyone sees your true worth? Like Ezra testing humanity from cardboard, many of us fear being dismissed before our story is heard. I understand the ache of feeling unseen, the desperate need to prove you matter despite circumstances beyond your control. Through these stories, I've learned that dignity isn't defined by wealth or status, but by courage and kindness. If this touched your heart, please like and subscribe to Homeless Stories for more journeys proving every soul deserves compassion.